Good morning and welcome again. I'm so glad you're here. As we dive into this sermon today, I wanted to explain a little bit about this whole entire series that we're starting on. So we just wrapped up the way as we went through Lent and Easter together, and we're still in the Easter season, but I wanted to start this new series I'm so excited about. I thought of this series and I felt like God laid it on my heart months ago, and it seems even more appropriate for us now. The title of the series is called Leap Over a Wall. It comes from Psalm 18:29, which says, "With you I can charge into battle. With my God I can leap over a wall." This is David's mentality in his entire life. He was completely dependent on God, completely trusted God. Not always, of course, and we'll get into that too, but he really had this incredible ferocity, this love, this devotion for God in his life. David's call, he was the most unlikely of character, you'll see. David, even though he's this hero of faith for us now, and we've seen all the good things that he's done and who he's become in our Christian heritage now, he at the time, as you read from 1 Samuel 16 this morning by the Roses, he was not the person that everyone thought was going to be anointed the next king of all Israel, but God chose him. God used him. God guided him. God changed an entire nation and thousands of lives with him and through him. I think that story, as we love this character David, I think that story we should put onto our own lives. It goes for us too. We have that kind of potential, this life-altering for not just ourselves, although that matters, but for everyone kind of call on our lives. We too have been called in a very similar way that David has been called. That's what this series really is about. It's the call of all people and how we can live fully into that. You know, the United Methodist Church, we have this book of discipline that sort of talks about our theology and our ways of practicing. It's what organizes us in a lot of ways. In the 2012 version, the book of discipline says this: all Christians are called through their baptism to this ministry of servanthood, outreaching love expressed in the mind and mission of Christ into the world to the glory of God and for human fulfillment. All humans, all Christians, all of us are called by virtue of our baptism into this. I talk about it like this, and other folks probably have too. I have vocationally chosen full-time ministry. It's my job. It's how I get paid. It's what I do day in, day out. But all of us, by virtue, are called into full-time ministry by virtue of our baptism. As we've been baptized into God's family, we read in Paul's writings. So how are we to be this people who've been called into full-time ministry? What does that really look like for us? How do we really embrace that and live fully into it in the day-to-day? Those are really the questions that I want to explore in this series. So I'm really, really excited about it and have been for months, and I hope you'll get excited about it too, because I think there's a lot in David's life and his ministry that applies for us here today. So today we're looking at the beginning of David's ministry. This is the first time, this 1 Samuel 16 passage is the first time that David was ever mentioned in the entire Bible. So it's right at the very beginning of it. Our passage talks about Saul, who was the current king of all of Israel at that time. He was their first king, and he had been rejected. The priest Samuel had heard that Saul had not been obeying God. God had sent Saul out to do these things and to accomplish missions and battles in a specific way, and Saul thought, you know what, this stuff is nice, I'm not going to destroy it. You know, this city's kind of nice, instead of getting rid of everything, I'm going to just keep the valuable things instead of doing exactly as God had said. So God, because of Saul's own greed, because of Saul's lack of trust in who God was and what God was doing, God rejected Saul. And Samuel knew this, and so Samuel now this priest has to go, and one of his responsibilities is to work on God's behalf, to anoint the next king, whoever that would be. Samuel heard that God had rejected Saul, and so he knew that it was time to go and anoint the next king. God calls him to go to the town of Bethlehem, where we see that he goes today, and he finds David's dad there, a respected man, Jesse. So there's Jesse, and all of his sons start coming out, and he starts looking through all of these sons, and they would have been impressive. They would have been well qualified. Jesse's line would have been one that would have been respected, and the people, those sons that were there that day would have thought, man, this is my opportunity to be a king. God's called me to be a king. They were faithful too. They weren't just being greedy. They really thought that their lives had prepared them for this moment. But Verse 7 tells us, despite all these exterior qualifications that made Jesse's other sons ready to be king, verse 7 tells us, the Lord said to Samuel, have no regard for his appearance or stature, talking about the sons that were not to be king. God says to him, God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans see only what is visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees into the heart. Finally, after Samuel goes through all 7 of these sons with these great resumes, perfect candidates to be king, God rejects them all. Then Samuel asks, well, Jesse, do you have any other sons? Because these aren't doing it. This is not who God's called. And it's sort of this reluctant, almost comical kind of reply. He says, yeah, there's still the youngest one, but he's out keeping the sheep. Now, keeping the sheep in that day was an important job, but it was also one of the easiest jobs. So the youngest son often did it. It was one that didn't require a whole lot of talent. In that time, they were able to just go outside and sort of guide the sheep. It was a little bit mindless and a low responsibility, even though it was important, a low responsibility thing to do. So he was really not considered at all because he was A, the youngest son, and B, he was out keeping the sheep. That sort of shows us what Jesse thinks of his youngest son. Not that he doesn't love him or anything like that, but that he's not bound for great leadership. He's just going to be the shepherd who kind of does what's needed. Finally, though, he gets David and he shows up as this beautiful young man, probably still a boy, honestly. He has red hair and fair complexion, we hear, which is an interesting kind of tidbit there tucked into our passage today. Red hair would have been a rarity during that time. So he probably had fair skin and red hair with all of these darker skinned and dark featured people. So he was considered a beautiful, kind of exotic, different looking person. He would have been athletic and strong from his walking around the hills as a shepherd with the sheep. He would have been knowledgeable in battle potentially, at least with the weaponry, because he had to fight off the dangerous predators that would come and try to harm the flock. He was good looking with beautiful eyes. This was the man that God had called. With all we know of David's story, it's easy to buy into what I just shared about David, isn't it? You just said, yeah, that's who I know David to be. He's good looking, athletic, able to handle himself. But he was the runt of the litter, the last of the sons, the youngest not trusted with anything more than tending the sheep. He wasn't the first in line to become royalty at all. He was especially regarded by the community at that time. His father didn't even think that he was worthy to be brought up as a potential for this job, right? He was left out there, so the community wouldn't have really thought of him as king material, as the next person that God had called to lead them. We now know how worthy he was. We've seen his life, but that's not the way it appeared to those who were gathered that day. He was just an average, normal boy from the town of Bethlehem. I wonder how often you and me, how we buy into that description of ourselves. We're just average, just typical, just normal people, whatever that means. We aren't called to do anything royal or huge or life world-changing, right? We just go about our little lives, hopefully with a small group of people who love us and we get to love too. We just fit in and try not to make too many waves. But the typical, everyday people are the ones who often make the biggest impacts in our lives. I asked some of you to share how the regular, ordinary people of your lives, just the day-to-day people that you interacted with, how they impacted your lives. And the Hills and the Pattersons were gracious enough to send these replies. Take a look and see how everyday people made a difference in their lives.
I think about a guy named Daniel Mason who was a campus minister of mine during my time at Chapel Hill.
Dr. Carl Douglas was the pastor at Blacksburg United Methodist Church.
When I think about the people that have had an impact on my faith over the years, one of the first people that comes to mind is my dad.
Well, the person that had the most influence for me to get involved in the church was one C. Thomas Latimer III.
But he was a key spiritual counselor and leader for me during probably the most transformational period of my life as I was trying to grow up and figure out who I was as a person and also try to develop my own personal faith. And, you know, what's interesting is that he probably has no idea how big a role he played in my life.
It was interesting to hear a pastor admit that he had faults and that he made mistakes, but he always leaned into the assurance of grace and
life.
forgiveness.
He has taught by example what it means to walk with integrity. He has an amazing prayer life. I remember since I was really little that he would carry around a little notebook where he would pencil people's names in with specific requests, and he would remember to pray for them by name.
But Tom and his wife Jenny, they were just a cool couple, and they were fun to do things with. And Tom got me involved in working with the youth group. And so 36 years later, a lot has happened. But thank you, Cole, for letting me share this story. And thank you, Tom, for getting me involved at Providence.
Thank you so much again to the Pattersons and Hills for sharing that. We see how everyday people, pastors, dads, moms, friends, teachers, everyone can make a difference in our lives. Who can make a difference? Truly, who can really be the person who connects another human being with the living, breathing, active, and all-powerful grace and loving embrace of God? The answer, it seems, is you can. I can. We all can, and we all should aspire and hope to be that. We're all designed to be in this community together, helping each other along the way. We're created to be together. You know, this past week's, the April 6th and 13th Time magazine, it had a special section in there called Apart, Not Alone. The introduction, it starts by talking about these mirror neurons that we all have in our brains, tons of them going on in our brains. And these mirror neurons, the article says, they're so important for us even if we don't know they're there. What Jeffrey Kluger, the author of the introduction, he says, they allow us, I love this line, they allow us to fathom one another, to learn from one another. They're basically the things in our brain that help us empathize with each other, help us get each other what's going on. When we see someone laughing, these mirror neurons are the reason why we want to laugh too. When we see someone in pain, perhaps even crying, they're the reasons that maybe our lip becomes a little weak and we feel tears welling up in our eyes. Even if it's on a movie, these mirror neurons we sense, even if it's acting, we sense the loss or hurt or whatever it might be, and we start feeling that too oftentimes. He writes this as we think about being apart but not alone. He writes, if evolution designed our brains for empathy, for caring, for the love of community and the binding of the tribe, we've been letting those gifts go to waste. He says we can still change that. All around us, if you look even a little, are examples of people practicing a sort of freelance decency, feeding, healing, educating others, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes on a scale that's national or even global. He says in closing, it is instructive that we are now beset by a disease that recognizes none of the ways we divide ourselves. We're humbled by the virus, united in a collective crouch. United, we will rise against it too. In similar union, if we choose, we can rise against the biases and injustice that have too long divided us. You, me, we are all called, baptized into God's holy family. We are all made biochemically, right? The things that make us who we are as human beings, we have been created to connect with each other. We're made, I think, to change lives, not to change them into who we are. We don't want to make other people just look like us or who we think they should be. Our best ideas, they so often fall flat. Rather, we change people and we change ourselves by living into the fullness of a God who has made each of us individual, beautiful, unique, called. And then together, we love more, we give more, we worship more, we help more, we heal more. In short, we find God in our very midst through our living and loving together with complete abandon. We are found by God as we live our everyday, normal, typical lives, ordinary lives that can make all the difference in someone else, in their life. I was thinking about this in my own life and what it means for me. It's a helpful and I think a healthy thing from time to time to think, who has helped me get to where I am? Who has helped me become who I am here today? Who has helped me become me? As I thought about that, one of the first names that flew into the top of my mind was Mrs. Sparks, my fourth grade teacher. Fourth grade's an important year. You learn so much as she says, we begin to learn more on an individual level and for ourselves a little bit. So I decided to track her down and reach out to her. Thank God for Facebook. It's not too difficult now. So I was able to find Mrs. Debbie Sparks and talk to her about this idea of everyday people making a difference in each other's lives, and how she, a teacher, an everyday person in my life, made a lasting impact for me. Here's a short video of our time together where we talked about that fourth grade class and the impact it's still having on my life today.
But did you have an awareness of the long-lasting impact you were making on those kids' lives in your classroom?
I hoped and prayed that it would be long-lasting. I know that having my own children at home, I was hearing some of the things that they would bring back from their class or from church, Sunday school, and things like that. And you do hope. And that's why you mentioned that little paper that, that I had done. That's why I did those, because I always felt that if there was something that could be kept, that you could be your own best witness. And so it was just things like that that you kind of hoped would stick around. But, you know, I felt like I tried to give so much to my class, you know, because, you know, you do fall in love with these kids.
We do.
You know, because here's the thing, you spend such a great amount of time. And one of the most important things to me was just the relationship with my students. You know, all the learning and things like that were so important, of course, because you have to. But there were some days where it was like a good church service. Sometimes the Holy Spirit says, put that aside and let's do something else. And as a teacher, you have to do the same thing. If you're on a roll with something and people are opening up in your classroom, you don't stop it. You know, you let the Lord, and if they don't learn that math problem that day, then you know what, that's okay. I think that it comes down to listening and just showing that you are concerned with their issue.
With her, I remember Miss U wore those masks at lunch, even only a couple times. Maybe it was on that fourth grade field trip that we took to the state capitol.
Yes.
Like for a part of the train ride, she wore like a panda bear mask, and you might have had like an owl mask on or something like that. And there was something very human about that made me connect with you in a goofy, fun way. And I think I was more open to hearing what else you were going to say because of the humanity of it. It was beautiful.
Well, that's another thing, the humor.
Yeah.
So I always felt like if I can laugh and make them laugh, whatever I have to do. I had one kid come up to me one year and he goes, "Are you the teacher that stands on top of her desk?" Well, yeah, I've been known to. It's those things, you know, you do whatever you have to do to make a point. And if it's stand on your desk or eat paper or whatever the things that I did, yes, you just throw it in there.
You know, there's so much more I could have shared with our time together. We laughed and teared up a couple of times as we shared how God's working in our lives today and remembering those times that have helped make us who we are today now. But two things that she shared really stuck out with me that I want to talk about a little bit more. She talked about our humanity and relationships, how those two things matter. Mrs. Sparks talked about getting up on a desk to keep our attention if that's what the day called for. But I think not only did she get up on the desk to keep our attention, but I think she got up on that desk because she's just a fun lady and she thought it would be interesting to get up there and teach from that perspective, how it might change the classroom and add a little bit of flair to it. It is just who Mrs. Sparks is. She likes to laugh. She likes to have a good time. She likes to truly connect with folks. That's one of the things that made her so relatable as a teacher, is that she let her personality come into the classroom. She wasn't some robot that taught us. She was a real person that we could connect with and relate to. David's story, as we'll explore in the coming weeks, it shows us that someone who is uniquely called a man after God's own heart, he can still be fully human too. We know all too well of David's sins, of the places that he messed up. David was a normal human being that had to eat and travel by foot and donkey, just like the rest of the people in that time. He is a hero of our faith, appropriately so, but he was also a real human being too. Eugene Peterson, in his book, Leap Over a Wall, where the sermon series title comes from, he writes about this saying, It's hard to maintain respect for it and be patient with the human condition. But human in the Bible is never a term of denigration or dismissal, but of honor. I love that. In the Bible, human is never a term of denigration or dismissal. It's one of honor. He says God doesn't take shortcuts to heaven, bypassing our troublesome humanity, and we had better not try either. Easter, this season, it teaches us so much, but we are still in the season of Easter. As we're in this season, we would do well to remember that the incarnation, Jesus physically with us here as God's presence really in the world, it teaches us that God, the way God works with us is that God enters into our humanity, doesn't bypass it, but rather embraces it and lifts it up as something good, even as it creates problems sometimes for us in our walk with God. Being human is a great thing, the Bible seems to tell us. God comes to us fully human, just as we are. Part of what it means, I think, to be a people who want to help each other and love each other means that we must be true to who we are. If you know me at all, you know that I like to laugh. I'm goofy. I'm not afraid to make fun of myself or you, right? I like to have fun. I can be obnoxious at times with that. I can be serious. I can hopefully be loving and caring too. I have bad days, and not just bad hair days. I have days where I'm just sort of grumpy. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed, as it were. That's part of being human and something we shouldn't try to skip over or pretend it doesn't exist. That God can't use that part of our humanity too. Instead, we fully enter into this possibility, the possibility of being human, and believe that God comes to this place. I shared Rachel Held Evans talks about God stooping down over and over and over so that we can relate to God in a way that we can understand. That God comes to us in ways that we can get fully human. God comes through teachers standing on our desk telling us that we are precious. God comes through fathers who intentionally teach us how to pray with a notebook, putting it in their pocket. God comes to us through campus ministers in that important time of life where we're young adults figuring it all out, as Andrew Hild shared about. Campus ministers who spend so much time just hanging out, exploring their humanity and what that means in relationship to God. God comes through friends who send silly, simple, sincere text messages to those around them. God comes through children who see mom and dad having a bad day, so they do the dishes or clean the house just because. God comes into our ordinary, our typical, our everyday lives and calls us, you, me, all of us to be ministers of the good news of Jesus Christ's love. The last thing I want to mention is why we're calling this series Leap Over a Wall. Again, I wish it was my idea, but it's a lovely quote from Psalm 18. And as I read and shared earlier, that verse says, with you I can charge into battle. With my God I can leap over a wall. The truth is, and you all know this, you don't need me to remind you, but it's worth saying again that we're going to find and face walls in our lives, metaphorically speaking, right? Walls that represent the challenges, the heartaches, the pain, the struggles, the mistakes, and more that we'll encounter in our lives. We will all face these events and moments where the paths of our life, this journey that we're on, take us to a point where there's this massive wall in front of us. And all we can see is this impossibility, how we're going to get around it, how we're going to cope, how we're going to find God, how we're going to be in light of what's in front of us. But with God in our lives, Psalm 18 tells us we can leap over any wall. And I'm convinced through my own life and through listening to you all too, that God so often shows up in our lives through the spectacular, yes, but maybe more often God shows up in the regular, everyday events that happen to us, through each other, through relationships. Mrs. Sparks, my fourth grade teacher who you just saw, she talks about how important relationships are for her, especially for her as she taught and led a classroom. She talked about listening and truly caring for her students. That's how she spoke to me. That's how my life is forever different because of her. She saw this young man who was trying to live a life of faith, and she called me a servant leader. She was the first one that I can ever remember calling me a servant leader. Those two words didn't go together in my fourth grade mind, but She told me that this is who God's called me to be, someone who wants to serve others and in doing so serves God. It's something that's remained paramount in my life even today. That's how my life is forever different because of maybe just one little comment that she made all those years ago. Because she was committed to listening, to caring, to investing, not in another student, just another year. She was in education for 25 years. It would have been easy to overlook that one moment, but she didn't. She heard me, and she shared with me honestly, and I'm forever different because of it, because of a relationship. We're called to living a life this way that's full of relationship, which is scary for the introvert, right? I'm an extroverted introvert. I love being around people, but I need to recharge at the end of the day. And God calls us to be in a place where we connect with folks exactly as we are, who we are, knowing our introverted or extroverted nature. Having relationships, it doesn't mean that we pretend the other isn't human or that they are perfect. We don't see their flaws because we need to enter into a relationship, right? Relationships are not about taking all that's on, relationships are about taking all that's on offer from this other embodied soul, this other human being, this fellow sojourner with us as we live our lives here on earth. Living a life that prioritizes relationships is a life that empowers you and those around you to leap over whatever wall, however high or wide they might be. It's one of the ways I'm convinced that God's incarnational love is made real for us. It's one of the ways God gives us and others strength and courage we need to leap over whatever wall may face us on any given day. And right now, there are walls in front of us. One being this coronavirus, this pandemic. But take heart. Be of good cheer. Praise God because God sent Jesus to show us the way. He loved and he ate and he walked and he lived and talked alongside us, showing us that God doesn't try to skip being human. It's not about birth and then getting to heaven. That's not the only thing that God is focused on. Instead, being here alive and now means something for us and for God. It's part of God's purpose and plan for all of creation. We are part of God's unfolding love right now. We are part of God's redemption of all of creation in the world. You are a huge and a needed, important part of that. All of us are. David, he was the last choice of the sons there that day. He was overlooked and thought of as Hakatan, which in Hebrew means insignificant, lowly, inconsequential, right? Not counting for very much. But God chose to use the seemingly lowly, insignificant, less than boy to change an entire nation. Indeed, David's changed the entire history of humanity by what he means for us and how Christianity has changed that too. God has chosen us. God has chosen you and me. You might not feel like you can make a big difference or you can have a big impact or a real difference on someone's life, but take heart, dear friends. God has chosen you. You are called, equipped, and baptized into the very family of God. That qualifies you to have the relationships that are real and that matter. That qualifies you fully human, imperfect and beautiful and wonderful. You are qualified and able to be part of someone's life in a way that can change their world, the world, in a way that can make all the difference. So go do it. I'm going to talk more about this in the future, but look at the graphic that's on the screen right now. You can see on the left side, it talks about being kind of going to church versus being a missional church, right? I got this from an email from the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. I hope we can all embody this different way of thinking, the shift from I go to church and instead embrace this idea that I am the church. You are the church. You matter. You have the power to change lives. You have the power to lift someone up over a wall, whatever wall they may be facing, and you don't know what that wall might look like for them. You don't know how that one little throwaway comment could be the very difference for them. You don't necessarily know how loving someone with the tender and patient, fully human and yet fully God working through us love We don't always know how that can change everything, but it matters. You change lives whether you know it or not. Leaning into these relationships, not ignoring our humanity. Lean in to the love and embrace of God who comes down right where we are and gives us all we need. Each one of us matters. And when we start acting like that, when we start acting like each and every person we encounter matters to God and to us, everything changes. We'll do this imperfectly. It's not easy for me to love all the time. I'm not easy to love all the time. But that's where God comes in. That's where God comes in and fills us with a love that's so outside of ourselves, it'll be so obvious that it's not us in the first place. A love that's so radical, so abandoning of all the self and want that we carry around with us, and instead is so full of who God is in the world. That kind of love helps those who feel lonely feel connected. Help those who are in pain know that it's okay to be in pain and that God's there too. Help those who feel like they're not enough or they can't make a difference. God's love changes all of that. And we start feeling like the sons and daughters of God that we are. Friends, you have been chosen. You have been called. You are called into full-time ministry, whether you do it by vocation or not. You have been called to go out into all the world and share the good news that Christ came for you and for me. Christ died, but it didn't stay that way. Christ rose from the grave and sent us out into all the world to share the good news that God loves each and every one of us just as we are. Thanks be to God.